We're going to continue our series this morning, Pre-Decide Better Choices. We're going to be talking about consistency. Now, please don't be asking my wife if I'm the right person to be talking about consistency. I don't know what she thinks, and I'm not sure I want the answer. Consistency gets kind of a bad rap. You'll hear an expression a lot of times, consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. This expression kind of implies there's something wrong with consistency. Only small people are consistent. People with great minds, people who are creative, do strange things. We just get up and randomly jump in. Well, here's some news. Consistency is important. How would you enjoy living with someone who was completely inconsistent? You never know from day to day what they're going to be like, what they're going to do. Anyone know anyone like that? A couple of years before I met Shirley, I was dating a young lady. She had a wonderful, bubbly personality, a wild sense of humor. She was an incredible amount of fun half the time. As I got to know her, I began to realize there was two people in there. On a bad day, she would look right through me, wouldn't acknowledge my presence, wouldn't speak to me. If I got her attention at all, she would growl. After feeling like a ping pong ball for about 6 weeks, I was kind of relieved when she broke up with me because I was trying to figure out how I was going to get myself out of this mess. Consistency is a very good thing when you're dealing with someone on a daily basis. We kind of like people to be predictable. So consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. That's a misquote. The real quote is this: a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. That puts a slightly different twist on this idea that consistency isn't important. Foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. People who cling to a way of doing things, not because it's a good way of doing things, but because, you've probably heard this one before, we've never done it that way before. You know, I've been to churches that clung to consistency, whether it made sense or not. I have a pastor, and my pastor would be rolling over in his grave if he knew I was up here speaking without worship first. You just don't do it that way. And consistency is important for this reason. Stay disciplined. Successful people do consistently what others do occasionally. Consistency takes effort. We aren't accidentally consistent, at least not in a good way. The self-help industry has kind of caught on to this. If you look out there, there are dozens of books, like The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Many, many self-help books about how to be consistent. Do these things and your life will be wonderful. The problem with them is they make it sound easy. But for many of us, it's a struggle. Even Paul found consistency difficult. You know, Paul wrote in the book of Romans these words: I don't understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. For I have the desire to do what's good, but I can't carry it out. For I do not want to do the good I want to, for I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. So if you have trouble wrestling with consistency, if you have trouble wrestling with always doing the right thing, you're in real good company. Even the Apostle Paul was subject to that. So that raises a question: how do we grow in consistency? How do we grow in consistency? It's not something that's going to simply happen. You won't magically walk out of here this morning a consistent person. I wish I was that good. So how do we grow in consistency? Well, number one, we start with the why. Why are we consistent? What's your reason for consistently behaving in this manner? What is it you're trying to accomplish? Who is it you want to please? Why are you being consistent? We're going to look today at the life of one of the most consistent people in the Bible, and that was Daniel. Daniel led an interesting life. Daniel was carried off into captivity in Babylon, probably around the age of 14, give or take a couple of years. Daniel had seen, the history of Israel. Israel split into two kingdoms. The Assyrians wiped out the northern kingdom of Israel, carried the people off into captivity.
This on the web.
Quiet. Nothing like a digital assistant that wants to help you at inappropriate times. And the people of the northern kingdom of Israel became known as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They were gone, lost, never to return. And then in Daniel's young manhood, the Babylonians arrived. They crushed the southern kingdom of Judah. They destroyed the city of Jerusalem. They tore down the temple. And Daniel spent his entire life living in captivity in a foreign land. We know from the dates of the reigns of the kings when Daniel was captured. And at the end of the book of Daniel, we find him in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So we know that at that point, Daniel had lived in captivity from about the age of 14 into his 80s. He spent his entire life living in captivity in a foreign land. But he was still consistent in his obedience to God. The book of Daniel says this: in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. Now, that raises an interesting question. Why on earth did the Babylonians carry off so many people into captivity? Well, it was a political strategy. It was one that had actually been started by the Assyrians. See, the Middle East then, as now, was made up of a bunch of small kingdoms, tribes, clans that were often at each other's throats. And as these great empires came in and conquered them, they had a large number of small clusters of very unhappy, rebellious people. So the kings of Assyria and later Babylon decided, brilliant idea. We'll take a lot of these people and we'll scatter them through the empire. We'll bring in settlers, settle them into this new land. By stirring the population pot, we're going to do two things. We'll eliminate rebellions, and we'll have a people who will eventually grow to be one big happy family. That was a nice theory, but it never really worked that well. Daniel was selected as one of these youths. They recognized his talent, so he was put into training. And we read this: the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. And they were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He asked the chief steward or chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now imagine for a moment you're Daniel. You're maybe 14, 16 years old. You've seen your nation utterly destroyed, your capital city in ruins, your temple pulled down. You might be wondering yourself, where was the promise of God to protect his people and for the Holy Land? My nation's gone, my temple's gone. The easiest thing in the world would have been for Daniel to simply go along. Well, we're living in a new situation now. So all those dietary laws, those festivals, the temple's gone. God doesn't seem very interested in keeping Israel intact. Maybe I'll just go along and do what's easy and comfortable. But he didn't. Daniel risked everything in rejecting the king's food and wine and asking for vegetables instead. He risked angering the king by disobeying him. He risked angering the king by offending him. You see, in a culture where hospitality is very, very important, slapping aside someone's offer of food was considered very, very rude. If you visit the Middle East today and you're in an Arab area and you walk into a shop and the proprietor offers you a cup of tea, take it. It's extremely rude to turn it down. And yet Daniel risked it all, risked the wrath of the king to continue obeying the laws of God. You see, the Babylonian food may have been wonderful, but with the sole exception of the Jews, people in the Middle East loved eating pork. Bacon was a big thing. Ham was a big thing. They ate all kinds of things that were forbidden under Jewish dietary law. And Daniel rejected all of that and said simply, yeah, vegetables will do. And he got away with it. We read these words. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. This was later in Daniel's life. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Daniel was a consistent man. He had a reputation for consistency. People knew that he wasn't corrupt. They went digging and they couldn't find anything that he had ever done that was wrong. Yet these officials were jealous because here was the king about to take Daniel and place him over all of them. And it goes on. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. They were stroking the king's ego here, telling him, for the next 30 days we're going to have a festival, and you, your majesty, you alone will be worshipped. The king, being a human being, liked this idea. And he kind of overlooked the effect it might have upon Daniel. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Daniel was consistent in practicing his faith. It didn't matter to him that the king had just issued a decree illegalizing what he was doing. Daniel just went home and he prayed just as he always had. And Daniel got caught. The trap was strung. The plotters reported to the king someone had disobeyed his decree. We read in Daniel, the king answered, The decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who's one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you. It's kind of a puzzling passage. This was in the Persian Empire. The Persians had a very weird law. The king could make any decree that he wanted to. He was an absolute monarch. But after he'd made his decree, even the king himself could not change it. It's known to history as the immutable law of the Medes and Persians. If you read the book of Esther, you'll see the same thing popping up there. Now, why such a bizarre law? We're not sure. Probably because Persians believed that any decrees that came from the king came from the gods. And of course, the gods don't change their minds, so the king can't. And this left Daniel, or the king, in a real mess. The king wanted to save him, but he was faced with the immutable law of the Medes and Persians, so he reluctantly had Daniel tossed into the lion's den. We kind of picture Daniel there looking like this. Daniel was still alive the next morning. God bound up the mouths of the lions, preserved Daniel there, because Daniel had been faithful to God. Daniel had done the right thing, even when it wasn't popular, and in the face of opposition, in the face of people who wanted him dead. And when morning came and they opened up the lion's den and found Daniel alive, the king was overjoyed. His decree had been fulfilled. Daniel had been tossed to the lions. If the lions happened to not be hungry, that wasn't the king's problem. And the king then tossed Daniel's accuser to the lions, who happily ate him. So why be consistent? We choose to be consistent because it's an act of obedience to God. Not because it's a comfortable thing to do. Not because it's just getting by and going along and going with the flow. We choose to be consistent, knowing that someone may well throw us in a lion's den. People aren't going to like it. They may be angry at us. But so what? We choose to obey God. How do we grow in consistency? Well, the why is to please God. The second thing we need to keep in mind is that we need to plan to fail. That sounds like kind of a weird thing to say, isn't it? I want you to go out today, pre-decide that you're going to be consistent, but plan to fall flat on your face. Well, remember, even Paul couldn't be completely consistent. Again, he wrote, "For I have the desire to do what's good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do. This I keep on doing." The consistency's hard. We delude ourselves into thinking we're going to get it all perfect from the get-go. We need to give ourselves permission to fail once in a while. And I think that's okay with God. Consistency's hard. When I was in college, my freshman year, I had a roommate who decided he needed to be in better physical shape. And his solution was he was going to get up at 5 o'clock every morning and go for a run. Now you can ask my wife how happy someone waking up in my room at 5 o'clock in the morning was going to make me. I'm a night owl. But he had rights. If he wanted to get up at 5 in the morning to go for a run, I could live with that. Monday morning rolls around, his first day of his new plan of going for a run. 5 o'clock in the morning, the alarm goes off. He's in an upper bunk, I'm in a lower bunk. Beep, 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 beep. And he's still snoring. So I pound on the bottom of his mattress till I get him awake. He rolls out of bed, staggers to his alarm clock, turns off the alarm, climbs back into bed, and goes back to sleep, leaving me lying there at 5 o'clock in the morning wide awake and not real happy. Tuesday morning rolls around. 5 o'clock in the morning arrives. Beep, 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 beep. I pound on the mattress. He rolls out of bed, staggers to the clock, turns it off, and goes back to bed. Wednesday morning, same thing. Thursday morning, same thing. Well, he's being consistent, but not really about the right thing. So it came time to have one of those difficult talks you have with college roommates whom you, at that point, really don't know all that well. And he agreed that, he really didn't like getting up in the morning all that well himself. And that, it was probably a little unfair to wake me up at 5 o'clock in the morning if he was just going to go back to bed. So he'd come up with a better plan and would go running in the afternoon instead, which, by the way, he never did. New Year's resolutions are tough. Anyone ever make a New Year's resolution? Anyone ever successfully keep a New Year's resolution? We make New Year's resolutions for all the wrong reasons. We make them to please ourselves. We make them as a thing in itself. And no one really takes them too seriously. Dieting is difficult. I've gotten to a point in life where I have to kind of watch what I eat. I missed being 16 when I could eat anything I wanted without gaining a pound. But boy, a diet, that would be difficult. Consistency is hard, at least being consistent in the right way. We have to allow ourselves the freedom to fail. Had my roommate on Tuesday gotten up, shut off the alarm, climbed back into bed, and gone running the other 3 days, I'd have been okay with that. At least he would have been trying. Shirley and I have a very good friend, and she's real consistent in a way that is kind of weird. In her mind, everything is either perfect or it's all no good. And there's nothing in between. So when her plans go south, consistently goes out the window because suddenly she's moved from perfection to no good. And a lot of us are in exactly that same kind of a state. That we give up pretty easily and we don't allow ourselves the freedom to fail. Does it displease God when we're inconsistent? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on what you mean by inconsistent. But what I do know is this. Since I became a Christian, I haven't managed to get away from sinning every so often. All too often. When I'm inconsistent and I fall down, do I look up and find God standing over me, his foot poised over me, ready to stomp me into a gooey pile of mush? No. I find him reaching his hand down in grace, ready to pick me up and set me back on my feet and help me be better. So inconsistency, give yourself permission to fail. Third thing, consistency is a journey, not a destination. How do we get there? How do we live consistent Christian lives? By knowing and following what Jesus taught and modeled. There's a lot in the Bible, and that may seem pretty overwhelming, but I'm going to give you this morning a real simple way of breaking it down, a real easy starting point. Jesus was once asked, "What's the most important commandment?" And that question was a trap, because I'm quite sure the people asking him that question were thinking to themselves, "Oh, we've got him now. He'll single out one commandment, and then we can accuse him of ignoring the other 9. But this is what Jesus said. "The most important one," answered Jesus, "is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength." Now, I've given these to you in a couple of different languages, which I think are common among us here. Hopefully, I managed to get these right. The translation isn't important. Use your favorite translation, use your favorite translation in your favorite language, but learn these verses. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This is the greatest commandment. And Jesus didn't stop there. He went on and said, "The second is this. Love your neighbor as yourself. There's no commandment greater than these." Leading a consistent Christian life isn't a matter of learning a long list of rules, long lists of do's and don'ts. It's a really simple matter that comes down to this. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. We need to have those words written on our minds, written on our hearts. We need to consistently live them every day of our lives. Learn them in whatever language you want, from whatever translation you want, but learn them. We're living in a very polarized time. People lose friends, they even lose family members for disagreeing with them. Reading the news sites has gotten so ugly that I don't even like to do it anymore. But I confess that one of my guilty pleasures is reading the comics. Some years ago, Shirley and I had discontinued the newspaper. With internet news sites, with online, cable news, we were finding more and more that the daily paper coming in the morning was all yesterday's news and contained nothing new. But I really liked my comics. And then the newspaper sent us a bill. They wanted us to resubscribe, and they wanted to be paid in advance for an entire year. And somehow I felt that $500 out of my pocket right now was a little much just so I could keep reading comics. But then I discovered, much to my joy, that most of the comic strips are online. And I found a site where I could go and read them. And one day I found this Peanuts comic, which I really liked. Snoopy with his bird buddies here. The Beagle Scouts. They're going to go on a hike. They're going to have a cookout. They're going to camp together. What a wonderful day of fellowship and fun. Not a single word balloon in that entire comic. Just a bunch of friends having fun together. But this comic site allows people to post comments on the comics, which I mostly ignore, because a lot of people get way carried away treating comic book characters as though they were real people. And heaven forbid that I ever look at the comments on the editorial comments. But looking at this one, I couldn't help but notice that the very first comment posted after this comic was long. And so I looked at it. It was a long diatribe that this comic is a leftist plot to to destroy the fabric of American life. It's a cartoon beagle camping with his bird buddies. Now, my suspicion is that person posting that may have been an internet troll, one of those people who simply delights in stirring up trouble. But that comment was followed by dozens of comments that descended quickly into an ugly and acrimonious and hideous political war about a cartoon beagle. And I think what shocked me the most is that somewhere about halfway down the thing, someone hoping to pour a little cold water on it had posted a comment that simply said, "Love your neighbor as yourself." And people piled on him. The very first comment on there started by calling him a libtard, and it went downhill from there. And as I looked at this, I thought to myself, do you not realize whose words those are? You're telling Jesus he's a stupid liberal. Think, people. But that's the world we live in. Last week, Tony made a point I want to repeat. Satan's strategy. Deceitful ideas that play to disordered desires that are normalized in a sinful society. And we see that more and more in our hyper-politicized, polarized world. Politics, way too often in many of our churches, is trumping faith. I've talked to a number of pastors over the last couple of years. It's getting more and more usual for people to leave a church, not because they're unhappy with the preaching, not because the children's program isn't serving their children's needs, not because they didn't like the snacks in the morning, but because the pastor didn't agree with their politics 100% straight down the line. The politics that have come into the church all too often are demanding that we take one of those two great commandments and ignore the other. Either we're going to love God with our heart, our mind, our soul, while hating our neighbor. Or at the other end of the spectrum, we're going to so much love our neighbor that we're going to affirm any deviant behavior, any sin in their life. And that's okay. We love people, we accept people just as they are, we affirm them just as they are, never mind what God had to say. We can't do that. We can't do that. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. It was the same Jesus who said both of these, and he concluded them by saying, no commandment is greater than these two. To live consistent Christian lives, our lives need to reflect those values. They need to be the things that people see about us. One of the problems we face today is we're living in a social media world. And when you deal with people face to face, most of us have some control over what we do. There's a little bit of fear there of social stigma if you behave like too much of a jerk. A little bit of a fear of a punch in the nose if you insult the wrong person at the wrong time. The exceptions we see of that tend to be shocking, and they tend to be things that we can remember. Actor Will Smith is probably going to be long remembered for his appearance at the Oscars, not for any award that he got, not for any brilliant speech that he gave, but for rushing up on stage to punch a comedian in the face for telling a joke about his wife. How much that's going to affect his life, who knows? Will his career recover on it? Who knows? But it was a shocking event because people just don't do that unless they're online. I really wasn't going to talk about this, but events of the last couple of weeks, I think, make it important. In this last week, we've seen two big events coming from and affecting online presence. The sale of Twitter to Elon Musk has been completed. He's already laid off top officers in that company, and he purchased the company with the threat to eliminate almost every control over the types of stuff people can post, say, and pass around on there. Before he's even taken charge, before the rules have actually changed, Twitter was immediately flooded with a flood of hate, of racism, of false information, of demonization of other people. And it's still technically against the rules. So I'm afraid of what social media is going to look like when all the streets are removed. It's bad enough with a few streets in place. And the other event that really got my attention this week, a man in California who was steeped in internet conspiracies. The list of them is long and growing. He bought into almost every online conspiracy, every online theory, every online lie. And he showed up at the home of Nancy Pelosi. She wasn't there, but he broke into the home and attacked Nancy Pelosi's 82-year-old husband with a hammer, fracturing his skull. You can think what you like of Nancy Pelosi as a person and of her politics, but I hope that shocks you. The things that we say matter. Words matter. Because there are people out there who are going to listen. And when we teach them to hate, people are going to get hurt. Our challenge going forward is this. Before you post, before you tweet, before you forward that message, before you like that posting, ask yourself the question, is this consistent with loving God? And is this consistent with loving my neighbor as myself? People aren't going to like it. We're living in a polarized universe where you either agree with me or you're the enemy. Well, if you haven't noticed it yet, and I hope you have, I hope you've read enough of the Gospels and what Jesus taught and said that you'll know this is true. But I don't think Jesus really particularly cares what the Democratic Party has to say, or the Republican Party has to say, or the Libertarian Party has to say, or fill in the blank with your favorite party. I think what Jesus was concerned about and what he cared about was what did the Father have to say. And when we take that into our hearts, when we practice it, we're suddenly not going to agree with any of these groups out here so polarized. And that's okay. Jesus, in his final prayer for his disciples, said these words, Father, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them. For they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. You know, the kingdom of God won when Jesus rose from the dead. We as Christians, first and foremost, before anything else, are subjects of the King of the universe, the Creator of the world, our Lord and our God. And our political alliances are secondary to that. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. D.A. Carson wrote these words: "The Christian task, then, is not to be withdrawn from the world, nor to be confused with the world, but to remain in the world, maintaining witness to the truth by the help of the Holy Spirit." Our job as Christians is to follow God, to follow Jesus, not to transform the world. We're living in an age when church attendance is declining. I read a survey recently about pastors, and over the last few years, an increasingly large percentage of young pastors are considering leaving the ministry because of the stresses of ministry, because of the polarization in the church, because of all the hate in the world. We're losing a young generation. They like Jesus. They like the things he said. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Go the extra mile for helping people. Put others first. They like that. But they don't like the inconsistency of so much of the church. If we follow Jesus consistently and if we practice those things consistently, it's going to really confuse the world. A friend of mine was a college professor for years. She taught at several different state universities. There were a lot of things we agreed on, a lot of things we didn't agree on. She was a classic political liberal. When we were talking about taking care of the poor, justice for marginalized people, care of widows and orphans, she was all on board for that. But then the latest fad of gender popped up, and she jumped into that bandwagon with both feet. She got very upset with me when I wouldn't tell her what my preferred pronouns were. There were a lot of things we agreed about. If you look at the things Jesus taught, well, those are neither liberal nor conservative. Those are Jesus things. Some of them liberal support, some of them conservative support. But it really confused her. She complained to another friend that she didn't understand me at all. I'm all over the place. My response to that was, no, I'm not all over the place. I'm not in a left place or a right place. I'm in a Jesus place. And this is where we should be. It's kind of a lonely thing, bucking the trend and obeying God. But we're never alone. I like the story in Daniel. This goes back fairly early in the captivity when Babylon was still in charge. The king issued a decree. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and people of every language, this is what you're commanded to do. As soon as you hear the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Well, Daniel's friends, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, refused to fall down and worship the image. And the king didn't like that very much. So he had them arrested, tossed into the fiery furnace. And that's not the end of the story. So the next morning, Nebuchadnezzar got up and looked into the furnace, and we read these words. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked the advisor, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, Your Majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego were tossed into the fiery furnace, but they weren't alone. The presence of God was with them. Scholars argue about who this 4th person was. Most of them think it was an angel. A few think it may have been Jesus himself there in the furnace with them. We don't know. This is Daniel in the Old Testament. We don't get flashing neon signs that say Jesus here. And it doesn't matter. They were not alone in the fire. Whatever happens to you in life, God is with you. However much people may not like the positions that we take, God is with you. They may not like it when you love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, but God is with you. They may not like it when you love your neighbor as yourself, regardless of the color of the skin, national identity, or whatever. God is with you. So to be consistent in life, we need to write those commandments on our minds and on our hearts. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. The worship team is going to come forward now for a time of worship and response. And I want us to ask ourselves, how consistent is my life? And in what is it consistent? Am I consistent in my following of Jesus? Or am I consistent in something else? Am I getting up to represent Him before the world? Or am I hopping out of bed and turning off my alarm clock and going back to sleep? We become consistent when we understand why we're consistent. We give ourselves room to fail. But we need to be consistent followers of Jesus Christ. Let's pray.